Microphone will work? Yes. So thank you very much for having me here, and I look forward to engaging with you on a conversation about the circular economy and what is the circular economy vis-a-vis of the perspective of the SDGs. So I just came back from the World Economic Forum in Davos, and if you follow on the news what the forum was all about, it's also about SDGs. It looks like no matter where we are, right here in the GCC or whether you are on the Swiss Alps, the conversation around the SDGs is becoming a prevailing conversation that we're having. Maybe because we're only 11 years to the goal of 2030, and we'd like to reach the goals. Now, first of all, can we reach the goals? Well, the question is really about whether the goals are attainable in the first place and they can represent something that we can programmatically achieve. One specific part of the conversation is about goal number 12, which is the one that we call responsible consumption. So let me start by providing you with a little bit of historical background. We have always historically reused and recycled a lot of the materials. If you're looking at what happened right before the 1950 in the Western Hemisphere, we had an appreciation for things because we were considering them assets. I'm going to give you an example. There used to be someone called the milkman. This was somebody delivering milk. And we were using the glass of the milk over and over again because in the way we were calculating the price of products, we were always determining that the bottle of glass was an asset that we can use over and over again. So the more we were refilling, the cheaper was actually the product. And in the 50s, we started to accelerate our production. It was an historical opportunity for the Western Hemisphere to recover from the disaster of the war. And what we did afterwards, we started to accelerate consumption cycle. So we started to think that maybe I can use things more, faster, and why not increase in the frequency? So one of the things we did, we changed the packaging. We started to think that if we change the packaging, so take, for example, your coffee cup that you might take from Starbucks, and you decide to drink your coffee, very likely you're going to dispose that right after. And think about the time of disposable cameras, the time of disposable lenses. So we went from a principle of using assets as much as possible, so we were decreasing the cost, to the use of products with relatively cheaper material for a higher frequency. What was the reason behind? Well, if you want to accelerate consumption, you have to find a reason why obsolescence is actually planned. So you have to start thinking about product becoming obsolete so you can buy them over and over again. That's fine. It was part of the history in the 20th century. We were trying to determine in which way we can accelerate our economy. As a matter of fact, aggregate demand increased significantly after 1950. 1950, 60, 70, 80, the golden age, where actually consumption was becoming the primary vehicle for economic growth. Services and aggregated services were equally growing, and as a matter of fact, more and more society were rediscovering consumption as a mechanism of growth. Now, you can argue whether this is morally acceptable or not, but this is not part of the conversation. The conversation is that within the current condition we have, maybe that model is becoming untenable for a number of reasons. In my lifetime, population doubled. So we're now over 7 billion people, and many of these 7 billion are now active consumers. We're estimating about 5.5 billion people in the world that currently are in some degree of emerging status or already emerged. So what happens when you're becoming an emerging economy, you tend to spend more because there is a correlation between the perception of self-image and how you're spending to reinforce how you think you are. We unfortunately created a couple paradigm in which you are what you spend. Secondly, as a matter of fact, we started to move more and more into cities. So urbanization rate around the world is increasing at exponential rate. The West is already fully urbanized, but there are many parts of the world where urbanization is only at the rate of 50%, like China, or 30% like India. And countries like Nigeria are also expected to become very populous countries. They're currently less than 50% urbanized. So in the years to come, urbanization and living in city will become an inevitable process where people will basically decide to aggregate in specific areas. So when this is going to be the case, the impact on consumption will increase even more, unless We started thinking about something that makes economic sense, but for some reason it's been under-discovered, underutilized for a number of years. And this is what the circular economy does. It's a reflection on how do we use materials more and more, so that rather than thinking about the end of life cycle, I'm reintegrating this value back into the economy. Let me give an example. It's easy to think about plastic because we're thinking about having a bottle of maybe water, drinking it, and then the same material goes back in becoming a plastic. It could be one string. The other opportunity, whether now, once I reach capacity to how many times I can recycle plastic, the same plastic is becoming something else. For example, bricks to build a house, or for example, material that are used in the construction. And then the conversation becomes from closed loop to open loop. This is only two strings now. Now imagine how many of this possible network and ecosystem, they're driven by the fact that the end of life cycle in one part of the world can become the beginning of procurement somewhere else. Suddenly we have created a model in which the end of life cycle is becoming the trigger for an economic model that tends to be revenue active. How much of this is actually possible? Well, there's an interesting study from Accenture who determines that there are about 4.5 trillion US dollars that are currently locked in the end of life, which can be physical waste, it can be digital waste, it can be any sort of space that is currently underutilized, it can be on the use of assets, it can redefine the principle of ownership. So we have more and more this conversation that currently are trying to assess in which way we consume by generating an end-of-life cycle. The end-of-life cycle is becoming a cost that currently we are incurring directly, indirectly. In economics, we can call it a sunk cost, a cost that we're willing to actually forego because we have no way to integrate this back into the value chain. Well, the news is, if we start integrating this back into the value chain, we are about to generate about 40 million jobs that currently we don't have in allocating resources that can be done both by automation, but also physical labor. There's something fascinating about the circular economy, is that it doesn't innovate only for the giant tech company. It's not only a software. It really deploys and reallocates resources on the territory by thinking about in which way people that would be naturally displaced by automation can be reallocated in jobs that tend to be even low-skilled, but with an entirely different mechanistic. I'm going to give you an example. So take, for example, in some country, the mail service, people delivering mail. Every household have a mailbox, you receive the mail. Most of them will deliver the mail, and when they go back empty. So that reverse logistics tends to be with a cost. Now, what would happen if instead of going back empty, they would also generate the collection point? So let's say, for example, toys. Because many families who have children, at one point in time, children grow, and unless you're having several siblings, there's a lot of toys that tends to be underutilized. What are the options? Well, you keep them in somewhere in the storage, you waiting for siblings to come, or eventually you try to give it as a present to somebody else. But there's a large part of the population that don't even think about this, they simply store it somewhere. So let's make an example that now the mailman is responsible to collecting used toys and bring them back to a warehouse. So the purpose is that we're trying to generate a revenue model out of the toys. It's going to go back to a warehouse, and we're going to sell it back into the market, or we're going to demanufacture them, recollect the plastic, and use it elsewhere. So just by having these two examples, I have generated jobs in bringing the toys back into the warehouse, because that logistical stuff right now is not utilized. And at the same time, I've created a business model in which now there will be a model that it will emerge from having recollected a specific type of material. And this is only, again, one example. So on the Harvard Business Review with my co-authors, we studied the reverse logistics of the postal office, and we noticed that the opportunity for employability are significant. Not only we are increasing employability, but we're decreasing cost. And let me take you to an example of all of those companies that are currently producing things where commodities are traded in the market. When you trade a commodity in the market, you're expecting the price to be determined by supply and demand. So you can think about copper, but even gold, or even aluminum, or any sort of material that tends to be traded will, of course, be determined by the availability of the same in the market. So we studied a number of companies that were able to recover part of the material at the end of life cycle. And so what happened to the price? Where their elasticity was actually, of course, at first impacted, but over time, because they were able to decrease the procurement of material by about 30%, they generated an income that they didn't have before simply by reintegrating things that otherwise would have gone through the traditional trade mechanism. Again, it shows you that the reflection on measurement of the value of end-of-life cycle can bring us back in a conversation about how do we now build value from what originally might have no longer a use per se. I'd like to provide you with a little bit of a point of reference. In natural systems, nothing is waste. Everything tends to be reintegrated back into some sort of use. Only in artificial systems, a primarily economic one, we assume that there is something called end of life. So it's really an unnatural process to define that at one point in time, things will no longer have a use. We argue that if we can do assessment on the end of life cycle, if we can determine what is the cost of asset by reutilizing several times, if we can reintegrate the principle about ownership, we'll be able to redefine opportunity we currently don't have. And this is where SDG number 12 is interesting. So the reason why I was at the World Economic Forum is because I'm part of an initiative called the Loop Alliance, which is powered by some of the largest companies in the world. So I was in a session where mainly Nestle, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo was present. And then we had the, of course, World Economic Forum, WWF, and few government agencies. And what they are currently doing, they're redesigning packaging. I'm going to give you an example. Toothbrush. We tend to buy a toothbrush, we use it, and at the end of life cycle, we tend to throw it away. So what if now, for example, Unilever or Procter & Gamble, we're redesigning product where we're keeping most of the body of the toothbrush and we're only changing the head? Well, interesting, if I tell you about this, you can argue it's a good idea. But if the product's not into the market, then it's becoming quite far-fetched. So now Unilever is launching a pilot with 5,000 shops around the world, a detachable hat for toothbrush. We will try to preserve the plastic on the original body, so that we're trying to redesign production only on the heads of toothbrush. The same is for razor for gentlemen when we shave in the morning. We tend to dispose at the end of the use the razor itself. So now what we're doing, and the packaging comes in plastic, we're trying to have a portable container that tends to be reused over and over again. And as point of recollection on the razor that are used, considering that it's one of the most expensive consumables that we currently have. So defining a benefit, which is an economic incentive, that can define in which way we use in things like a razor. And the same goes, for example, for fruits and vegetables. A lot of the fruits we use every day tends to be cosmetically very good looking, like fruits is supposed to be aesthetic. But there is something true about agriculture is that sometimes fruits and vegetables don't really come in perfect shape. I remember when I went to a supermarket lately and I saw apples that were shining, and they were really shining, to the point in which you could mirror yourself into this. Of course, this is done to please the eyes, but in nature, you might also have apples that don't look so perfect. So what happened to the imperfect goods like fruits and vegetables? Right now, we waste it. In Europe, where you can argue there is already a sophisticated policy framework to avoid some degree of waste, about 46% of the food waste, or the waste of fruit and vegetable tends to be happening primarily because of how the things look. And in terms of the value chain, we are wasting currently about 31% of the entire value chain, primarily because of how we package portion and now what we do when, for example, at the end of the day, food is actually left on the shelves. So there is a rethinking from a policy perspective of what needs to be done. But as I'm trying to wrap up the conversation we're having, this is what I'd like you to bear in mind. The SDG will only happen if we start matching an economic model attached to this. If we're only going to think about this as in aspirational terms, countries that are rich and prosperous might have the maturity to talk about this, but I always consider that the rest of the world does not have yet the ability to think about it because they might just becoming emerging. So how do we engage them to transition? It doesn't have to be a cultural revolution. It can be a revolution of the things, the way we design them, the way we're having this large organization bringing into the market product that tends to have already a reuse function or characteristic inside. So it goes into retailing, consumption, and consumables in general. It goes into organization capable of identifying the value that currently is trapped in the value chain that can be reintegrated back. It goes into the government being able to create in policy that will be able to create incentive for companies to work together, creating a market of or basically end-of-life cycle stuff that can now become an active business model. And it goes into how we'll be able to measure this, not only from a perspective of how society is improving, but also how, as a business community, we're generating economic incentives so that it becomes self-explanatory why we should go into this direction. As my final wrap-up, the circular economy is not environmentalism per se. It's probably the most interesting business model innovation that I have come across in the last few years. It's reflecting on a part of the value chain that currently tends to be ignored, but by integrating back into the conversation, we can trigger and unlock trillions of dollars that currently are there, but they're underutilized, and naturally we generate employment, which are two of the conversations that in time where stagnant and slow growth are becoming prevailing topics, might be great to actually take off. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mark. That was fascinating. Here's to reusable toothbrushes. I'll keep it very brief. Please enjoy the lunch, enjoy your networking, and we'll see you back in here at 1 o'clock where we'll resume the session.